Tim Harcourt is one of Australia's most celebrated economic voices and business and economics writer. Among the many positions he's held, he was formerly an international economist with the Reserve Bank of Australia. He was the first chief economist of the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, otherwise known as Austrade. He was the professor of practice in economics at the UNSW Business School, and he's currently the chief economist at the Institute for Public Policy and Governance at the University of Technology, UTS. He also authored the extremely popular book, The Airport Economist, and has since followed up with another book called The Airport Economist Flies Again. This content also doubles as a podcast, and largely everything he does that informs his writing and his public speaking and his podcasting is about making economics and international trade accessible to the whole community. Tim has been writing a lot since last Thursday on the Russian invasion on Ukraine and has specifically been focusing on the Russian economy and the efficacy of sanctions, but then also particularly what the sort of unintended or otherwise intended consequences are going to be for the Australian economy. So as you will have seen, the last few episodes I've done on the podcast have been trying to look at this current European war from as many different areas of expertise as possible. And so I reached out to Tim in the hope to speak with him about exactly those topics: the Russian economy, the efficacy of sanctions, and then also where Australia fits into this whole picture. So share it wide, share it around, and most of all, just keep Ukraine in this moment at the top of your mind. Without any further ado, here is Tim Harcourt. Tim Harcourt, good evening, mate. Thank you for joining me.
Good to be with you.
So you've been writing quite a lot about this current moment, specifically from an economic point of view, how it might affect Australia, commentary on Russia's economy, and then also the efficacy of sanctions. I just want to open up with you explaining to me and the audience why the Russian economy actually matters. This is from your piece in the UTS. You say, like Australia, it's a major global supplier of commodities in terms of oil and gas, but also nickel, palladium, coal, copper, and wheat.
No, that's right. I mean, although Russia's this huge landmass, it's got a huge population, and its economy is about the size of Australia. But if you consider commodity economies around the world, if you consider oil and natural gas, palladium, Russia is a superpower. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, pretty much after Putin took over from Boris Yeltsin, Russia did what economists said you should do. You know, they invested in their comparative advantage, exporting gas and oil and palladium around the world, and not manufacturing much at home and importing a lot of, well, now luxury goods from Europe. So Russia, is a significant economy in energy, and a lot of countries, particularly in Western Europe, are net importers of energy, and that's sort of why Russia matters.
Okay, so much has been made of the sort of heavy over-reliance of Europe on Russian gas. Are there other specific fragilities in different commodity supply chains for other countries with copper, wheat, or one of the special metals? Or is it really the big geopolitical focus here is the gas?
I think gas is the one that gets the most attention. 20% of German reliance on natural gas and high data elsewhere, including to other parts of the EU. You're quite right. There are other metals to do with the automotive sector that depend on Russia and their supply chains, and in the agricultural space, wheat exports out of Russia are a big deal, particularly to China and East Asia, as they are to Ukraine, for that matter. So, sitting in Australia, when we think of oil, natural gas, and wheat, we think of ourselves and we think of Russia, and we think of wheat, we think of Ukraine. It has the world's best, 70% of the world's best soil. So agriculturally, you could say the Ukraine is a superpower, as they were, the breadbasket of the old Soviet Union.
What are the big implications then of all of these economic sanctions in Russia if their entire lifeblood relies on a globalized economy that can buy their things?
Well, you're quite right. And if you think the economy is tough for the average Russian now, just imagine what it's going to be like as the sanctions bite. You've already seen the huge drop in the ruble. which basically means you're reducing everyone's income within Russia. And as you mentioned, with such a large population and such terrible income inequality, given that the oligarchs and a lot of them, the former Communist Party members, picked up a lot of the key assets of the state, the distribution of income in Russia is a real issue that we don't have, say, in Australia, or you wouldn't have to the same extent in Sweden, for instance. So that has real implications. Not only in terms of the export reliance, but also when all these oligarchs and the upper class of Russia have been importing luxury goods from Italy and diamonds from Belgium, and they're buying football teams in the UK. And at first, when the European Union announced the sanctions, some of the countries were pretty slow. Belgium asked for a carve out for diamonds, and Italy asked for a carve out for luxury goods. So really, when you think of it, if you start turning the tap off, not just to the ordinary Russian person, but to some of the wealthier Russians, they're going to get a bit cranky. And also, not issuing them visas and changing the flight patterns of the world, that's going to make them cranky too. And that's, I think, where the sanctions are heading to not just hurt Russia, but to hurt the people that may be influential in public policy in Russia.
Yeah, that's been a really interesting revelation out of all of this. Sort of a very transparent pulling back of the curtain onto Russia, that the majority domestic populace might have very little influence over the domestic policy or over sort of Putin's agenda. But as soon as you start restricting an oligarch's extraordinary lifestyle, that could actually be the thing that creates the domestic pressure. And that is just such a disgusting example of how corrupt and sort of rotten the political system is in Russia.
Yeah, well, that's right. Really, Putin made this pact with the oligarchs. I'll let you have the assets and I'll let you do whatever you want around the world, but you've got to keep out of politics. And that's sort of been the extraordinary, pact, Faustian pact he had with the oligarchs. Now, once that starts to unravel and they can't do what they want, then it could be quite different. And I think that's why you've seen this huge pro-Ukraine sentiment in social media, and now it's trying to reach out to Russian people. I heard that on Google you can leave restaurant reviews of Russian restaurants, and people are from all over the world are getting on there and calling for Russian people to rise up against their government. So it's going to be a very interesting time. Mm-hmm. When the Tsar conquered the Ukraine and other countries, in the Great Russian Empire in the 19th century, there's no social media to fight back with, so it's going to be quite different now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, how unprecedented the amount of attention given to this conflict is. And I suppose Putin, who reportedly doesn't even use the internet and sort of just exists in his own little bubble reading about Russian history, I think he's completely miscalculated the effect that social media would have on his opinion.
They said that towards the end of his regime, Stalin, stayed in his country house and had very little contact with his Politburo. And it sounds like under COVID, Putin has had the same. He has those big long tables because he doesn't want to go near anyone. And it sounds like, in Australia they talk about the Canberra bubble in terms of politics. Well, imagine the Moscow bubble within the very top elites. It'd be very hard to get outside opinion, particularly when they're all scared of him too.
Yeah, people for the last 2 years have had to quarantine extensive periods of time just to be in a room with him, and supposedly he's had almost no human contact. There is a lot of sort of playing the psychologist through the internet, right?
Yes,
you don't really know, but it is a pretty grim picture, the one that's been painted of him. I want to follow up on the sanctions question and ask you how effective you think they are at deterring behavior. So they clearly work as a weapon, but their effects can be relatively simply priced in as a part of the calculus to make the decision in the first place. So generally, how effective do you think sanctions are, and then in this specific instance?
That's a great insight. People do factor them in, don't they? Sanctions haven't proved to be all that successful. They've tried them in Myanmar. They tried them before with Russia. They tried them with South Africa for years, and the trade sanctions worked. It was only the investment strike that really affected South Africa and the fall of communism that affected that. But it's interesting with these ones because they're a lot tougher, and there's more people involved. I mean, the Swiss got involved. The Swiss, who we know did business with Nazi Germany during the Second World War, the Swiss have joined in the EU sanctions. So that's quite something. And it could be, in the short run that the sanctions will have funny effects on prices, and amazingly probably commodity prices will shoot up in a way, and that will probably benefit some commodity exporters like Russia and Australia and Ukraine. But over time, the sanctions could really bite. I mean, we're already seeing the drop in the ruble. Once the announcement was made, I mean, once Vladivostok opened, people tried to get rubles out, and the central bank was actually making companies give rubles back to them because they're worried about their reserves. So that's back to back to the USSR, so to speak. We've had a huge hike in interest rates. So it's going to be pretty miserable on the ground, I think, in Russia. And of course, now, once the oligarchs have their private planes seized all over the place, their private yachts, they'll start to get pretty snaky too.
I also just want to re-emphasize how big Russia's population is. I was shocked when I learned it was 145 million, which I looked up the other day. I was under the impression it was 30, 40 million, right? Just very, very sparse over this giant country, which is the largest landmass in the world. But to have 145 million people.
And also, I mean, Ukraine's 44 million. I mean, Ukraine's not a small province. That's a significant country. That's double the population of Australia.
And a huge landmass too.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is. So Ukraine's a significant country.
But just like double down on the idea that 145 million people have barely a say in the public policy of their country. I don't know. I think it's just something that's been really hammered home over the last week, which personally, and I think broadly, people sort of didn't even think about or discounted or didn't realize.
Yeah, we hear a lot about China being over $1 billion and India. We don't hear a lot about how huge Russia and Brazil is. There was all this talk about the BRICS some years ago. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa added for a while. But we don't actually think of Russia as a huge population. You're quite right, as well as a landmass. And a very diverse population, as we know, ethnically. And that's even before you include those former Soviet republics. I spent a lot of time in Kazakhstan. The East Asian in origin, Muslim speaking Russian. Very very different, very different ethnically to what you'd see in Moscow or Ukraine.
Can you explain why the Swiss ended up sort of joining in this fight? Why they ended up joining in?
I was amazed by that because they're not an EU member. They rarely get involved in anything, the Swiss. It could have been that they knew that once the EU sanctions were put in and the UK had already done it with Biden and the US, that the Russians would all fly to Swiss banks, and they probably felt they didn't want to have Ukrainian blood on their hands. They wanted for once to sort of be an international team player.
Wow, you think so? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, it's because all they're worried about the stability of their own financial system if they had a huge flood of Russian money.
But they've already got the blood of all the other kleptocrats around the world's blood on their hands. Like they are not impartial to an African despot, a Saudi despot. I mean, do you think it's just the overwhelming public opinion was enough that this was bad PR for them to not get involved, or is there something more happening?
It's got to be bad PR, I think. I mean, even FIFA said you can play as the Russian Football Union, which is like the Olympic compromise. You play as the Russian Olympic Committee. You're Russian Olympic Committee, but you're not Russia. They've backed down. I mean, FIFA, the most, corrupt autocracy, lover of dictators of all time, even they've backed down. So I think
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
I think there's something in the momentum that President, Zelensky's gathered support for Ukraine is quite extraordinary. We don't have I mean, we have a sizable Ukrainian population in Australia, not huge, but they've all been out on the streets and people with them in streets of Sydney and Melbourne and all around the country. So something about Ukraine, I guess it's a real David and Goliath struggle, huge, small country being picked on by a
Hmm.
large empire. People have come out for it.
And it feels so unprovoked as well, which maybe is calling people to action more so.
Yeah, you're right. It wasn't a tit for tat back and forth, was it? It was sort of a huge strike. And I think just seeing just the sight of all those Ukrainians walking through the snow with their little children across the border to Poland, I think has struck home somehow.
Yeah, I was reading on Twitter yesterday an anecdote from a guy I follow who lives in Amsterdam, who had a couple of Ukrainians doing renovations on his property, and once the invasion had happened last Thursday, they sort of just said, "Hey, sorry, we got to go home," and they left all their tools there and
That was it.
drove into the Ukraine.
No,
But
no, that's it.
supposedly, yeah, and it's like there's also the current heavyweight boxer of the world, not Klitschko. I forget his name. He's still
Yeah,
fighting.
yeah, he's got to
Who,
fight. He said
yeah,
he's
is a
going to. Yeah,
millionaire,
that's
lives
right.
in America, and flies home. Obviously Zelensky's saying, I don't need a ride. I just need ammunition.
Oh, good
It's
line.
created this overwhelming support on one side. It's so asymmetric, the support for the Ukraine.
Yes, incredible, isn't it? And even the Russian community in the United States and UK, Australia, Canada, they've been coming out saying they want peace with Ukraine. Stop this Putin. There's a big anti-war movement in Russia and in the Russian community.
But all of what we're sort of saying right now, I think, couples into what we started off with, that he has just completely underestimated the social media side of this. He sort of didn't realize that the rest of the world wouldn't buy his denazifying propaganda as well as outside of his own population, and that the rest of the world would actually get involved. Do you think that maybe he just thought people wouldn't care that much because historically they maybe didn't make so much noise with Crimea in 2014 and stuff like that?
Yeah, they didn't understand Crimea. This seemed a bit more direct. And the power of, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is a very, very effective performer. My ancestry, I've got the name Harcourt, but originally was Harkovits from Kharkov, the Jews of Harkovits. And my grandfather used to always say to me, if only the world was, run by a Jewish comedian, it would be a lot safer place. Funnily enough, Zelensky sort of, at least in this beginning phase, he's
Wow.
he's, he's performing pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. To return to the economy and sanctions, so I think sort of paradoxically, Russia being such a huge commodity exporter also kind of makes them self-reliant to a degree. Loads of wheat, energy, etc. I think that Putin would have taken into account huge sanctions and sort of just said, fuck it, we can rely on our own produce, our own gas, energy, etc. But do you think that sanctions have been more severe than he would have envisioned?
Yes, I think they have, and I think the vast scope of the countries involved, he wouldn't have expected that, and the breadth and width of the sanctions. He might have thought people would throw out a bit of vodka, and he might have thought that there would have been a sort of don't buy Russian, but the gas that was extraordinary. The very direct freezing of assets, even of the Russian central bank, that was pretty big. And the SWIFT, these are it's uncharted territory for sanctions in the global economy. They're not conventional, and you haven't had so many countries do it all at once against one country. And I think your point is right. He probably thought, I've got the reserves. I can, I had enough money to put on the Olympics and the World Cup. I've got I can get through sanctions like I did with Crimea, but these are much bigger, and I don't think anyone expected that. I don't think any. I mean, obviously the West didn't expect him to invade either, and I don't think he expected the response. And I don't think I think you're right. Your point you made before. I don't think he thought Ukraine would have that much global sympathy, but it does. And ironically, I reckon Zelensky, in a way, he's probably going to save Ukraine. He'll probably save Trump from running again, in a way, because Trump was very close to Putin. A lot of his supporters were very pro-Russian, and he may have saved Taiwan because China's been sitting back, watching to see what Putin would do and how people would respond, and they've seen stuff they don't like, particularly if they decide to have a crack at Taiwan. So, it could be that, the president of Taiwan could send a slab of beer over to Ukraine, I think, and say thanks very much because they've done him a big favour.
Speaking of Zelensky, I haven't heard from him since the weekend, maybe Saturday or something. Have you seen any news of him?
I only saw him walking
stuff
through
like that?
Kiev on Sunday, and then I think he sent his defence minister to Belarus for the negotiations. So I imagine he'll make a statement after that. But pretty brave, not running.
Oh, absolutely. No, it's complete skin of the game, and the whole world's responded to him, like as you've said. So you've spoken a lot about the sort of immediate and direct consequences from all the sanctions. The ruble's at the floor. The domestic economy is going to the average Russian is going to really suffer. But could you speculate into some of the sort of unintended second, third, and fourth order consequences from this wave of sanctions?
Yeah, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, maybe, some people have been fearful that then Russia will get more closer economically to China. China's sort of been a bit frosty since it started going wrong in the Ukraine. So it might be at the moment probably Russian isolationism rather than alternative superpower arrangements. There may be a real rethink of energy sources in Europe. I know that the Germans weren't keen on nuclear power, whilst France was. There might be a bit of a rethink, I think, of nuclear power, despite what happened in Japan and so on. I think that people will think really carefully about energy, the energy mix between nuclear, fossil fuels, gas, and renewables. They're probably going to be a little bit more cautious now, I think, because they know that having lots of gas and having lots of oil is a pretty big trump card for those nations. So you wouldn't give that up easily. And I think in some ways you might see a strengthening of the European Union now. I mean, they're pretty ordinary under COVID. They were nicking vaccines off each other and all sorts of things, whilst Europe's seen a bit like it's finally got its act together. I mean, it was really the Poles that led it, and even though the UK is not a member anymore, the UK was very strong in Ukraine early, and they sort of led Germany and the rest kicking and screaming into doing something. But now they've done something, so that might, Putin's managed to unify Europe, something that no one else has managed to do.
So it might drive a shift in the way that Europe thinks about energy independence. So what does that mean? More maybe maybe some of the massive ESG financing and funding and tax breaks could be sort of moved towards nuclear, or is it looking at other trade partners for their energy?
And maybe countries like Qatar that are big on LNG and Australia are going to play a bigger role now, and it could be too. I think Japan and South Korea, very energy dependent nations, have looked really closely at Russia and possibly what China could be doing in the South China Sea, and they're probably thinking we've got to have a bit more multilateral action now, just like the Europeans did. So I think you may see some quite positive action, like we've had with the Quads in Australia, with India and Japan and Australia and the US. So some of the natural alliances going towards a multilateral position might actually help, rather than being at the mercy of Russia and potentially China in the future. I think Ukraine will get EU membership tomorrow.
Yeah, really.
Or soon.
Soon, right? Yeah, but you think
Yeah.
that they'll
They'll
be
just give it
fast
to them,
tracked
I think.
into the EU because of all of this?
I think so, yeah. It'd be hard to keep them out.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess that is best to be addressed in the last question. That whole
Yeah.
calculus of how much overt support and alliance with the West do we want to give Ukraine?
Yeah.
But you'll see why later. Weird fact is that Russia is Australia's largest kangaroo importer.
Yes.
That's a direct line of revenue, which is clearly going to be affected. Elsewhere, you just sort of suggested that we could almost be an LNG supplier to Europe and East Asian countries. Is that, how does Australia fit into this picture? I really wasn't aware of the potential of Australia exporting energy to Europe. It just seems like too far to go, but maybe not.
Well, maybe not. I mean, a lot of it would have been locked into South Korea and Japan and China, and we've got LNG links with the United States. But, who knows with this massive shock what could be done. I'd imagine that the Europeans will go to Qatar first. But, with all these hydrogen and lithium and all these new energy sources coming on board, that'll have to be a change. I mean, Europe and Australia is doing pretty well with renewables. They've got very strong links with Spain and Germany and the Scandinavians, so that will grow. But I think some of these superpower sources of energy might change, and it could be that some of the sort of defence trade alliances might change a bit as a result of this shock.
How would the defence trade alliances change?
Well, there's already movement with respect to Japan and India and ASEAN, United States and Australia, and there's the AUKUS agreement between Australia, UK, and the US. So I think some of the more traditional defence alliances have started to come back a bit more, and the Europeans getting involved in defence is a new one. I mean, they've started to actually arm Ukraine, and that's a big change because pretty hard for those nations to get involved in military, action or even hints of it. So that might change, I think. I think defence budgets are going to increase.
Like just across the board?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Because we haven't seen people use weapons on the massive scale that Putin has until this week.
Specifically in Australia, if there was a very big boost in LNG exports, where in Australia is that actually situated? I really know nothing about the liquid natural gas market in Australia.
Okay.
So where would it be? And
Western Australia, Northern Territory, and Queensland. So the LNG terminals off Darwin and off the northwest, and in Queensland. So the sort of the resource-rich states.
it's in the right spot for transport.
Oh yeah, well that's right. That's handy.
Yeah. Okay.
That's handy. Yeah. I mean, a Chinese. There was an issue with couple Chinese naval vessels going through the Arafura Sea about a week ago. It's sort of been blown off the front page with Ukraine and Russia, but there was a little bit of incident in the Arafura Sea, so that people are quite conscious of that.
At the moment, how significant is that industry in Australia, liquid natural gas?
Oh, we'll probably be like Qatar by 2030, so it's a pretty significant.
So it's a huge line of income.
Yeah, no, we haven't reached our potential there, and with hydrogen, I've just done a show on South Korea, and we've got big hydrogen ties with South Korea and Japan. So yeah, there's a lot of new sort of resource action in those areas that's quite interesting. And then, I don't know much about it, but lithium, the stuff they make in batteries for electric cars, that's very big in South America and in Australia. So that will be another line of export income, I think. So there's quite a lot of new things that are emerging now beyond the traditional wool and wheat and coal.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how unintended consequences might work? I mean, who would have thought that if you look at a European conflict between sort of two Eastern European states, Australia might all of a sudden have a big new line of income, a country on the other side of the world. If Asia, South Korea and Japan look at Russia and say, we don't want to be reliant on their energy at all, Australia's a pretty good partner. You would think. I mean,
very reliable.
They're kind of reliable.
Yes.
Yeah. You sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but could you sort of speak more about how China might be either emboldened or unemboldened over their Taiwanese ambitions from what they've seen over the last few days?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because the big talk before the Beijing Olympics was that Putin and Xi Jinping had sort of, thawed their frosty relationship, and they say Xi Jinping sort of gave them the green light to they wouldn't stand in their way if they did something in Ukraine. But who knows with Putin? And people thought, well, this is a dress rehearsal for Taiwan. Now, hasn't gone well for Russia so far. Taiwan's an island. You don't just roll your tanks over the border. And China would have now seen the reaction from the rest of the world. So I suspect they're going to hold their fire on this one. It may not be worth it. I mean, Putin's this huge gambler. He goes into Chechnya, he goes into Georgia, he takes on the Crimea. He's a huge gambler. I don't think Xi Jinping is. I think they've been aggressive in the South China Sea and brutal with Hong Kong, but I don't think they're going to. They know that Taiwan would be quite different. In some ways, with Hong Kong, they were covered. Hong Kong, they were covered because they sort of got it handed back, but Taiwan's not going anywhere. They're not going to be handed back.
Yeah. It's fascinating to think about how, differently it may have gone. Like, imagine if the Ukraine didn't put up this enormous defense, the rest of the world might think, oh, okay, well, I guess this makes sense, or this is terrible from Putin, but hey, what can we do about it? But since there is such this strong defense, the rest of the world's like, hey, this is so wrong. And it's just interesting how the paths can diverge like that based off, I don't know, a couple of extraordinarily patriotic speeches from Zelensky and huge amounts of attention on social media. It's just interesting to think about how some things might hinge such drastic consequences.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, seizing the moment. If he'd fled on the first day, would have been all over, I think.
Yeah. Imagine. Crazy. Finally, Tim, from early January, since the story of this Russian build-up on the Ukrainian border, every escalation has been a surely he can't do that moment. And given his recent precedents for doing those precise surely he cannot do this moments, how are you thinking of his nuclear threats?
Yeah, alas, I think you've almost answered your own question. I mean, that there was this great piece in Washington today about all the Russian experts, all the Putin experts in Washington was saying that surely he won't do this. He always does. And so that's what they're thinking. Now, the question is, where would you attack? Because you're not going to send a nuclear weapon to Ukraine, because that's apparently Russia, according to him. So would it be aimed at Western Europe? And then you're going to get huge retaliation. So that's the big worry. Will the people around him stop him getting to that point, is the other question. I don't know if you've ever seen Death in Stalin, that satirical show about the last days of Stalin. I mean, that just shows you the tightness of that Politburo, but it also means that someone who's flying high 1 minute can be replaced pretty quickly if there's enormous pressure. But it's not something I want to contemplate, but we are not dealing with a rational actor. It's not a Oxford debating society. This is serious stuff.
It may not be something you want to contemplate, but surely you sort of have, and also maybe seen discussions of it or had discussions yourself. Like, could you comment on the potentiality of it happening? Can we write it off as it's too absurd, or is there? I don't want to be like a fearmonger or anything, but or is there a reason for me sitting in Stockholm to think, could a Western European city actually be blown up by someone who's just gone all in and says, fuck it, I'm going to leave a legacy. I don't care if they remember me as a villain. I just want to be remembered. Is this, I mean, is it too much of a caricature way that I'm thinking about it? Or, yeah, how do you think about that?
Look, I wish I could say, yeah, it's too far-fetched, but it's not. And when you look at Putin's speeches, they're all about, the emotional hurt that Russia's gone through, not just in the Ukraine, but every incident, back to Tsarist times. I mean, that's how he operates. Very emotional, very patriotic. I think he said to Australian Prime Minister in 2014, Tony Abbott, "You're not a native Australian. You're a convict from England. I am a native Russian." He's very, 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 very clear about that. The other story was at APEC when I interviewed Putin. I said, "Is Australia what you thought it would be like? Has it met your expectations?" And he said, "I never think about Australia." That was his sort of response. So I think his responses have been very emotional, very patriotic, and that's why I don't think we can, think about a rational player. And there's something about I think Putin feels that when he took over from Yeltsin, that he tried to play nice with the West. He asked Bill Clinton, "Could Russia join NATO? We're in APEC. Can we ultimately, be part of all your alliances?" And he got knocked back, and so he probably feels that he played Mr. Nice Guy and Mr. Diplomat for so long. The only way Russia ever gets any respect is with aggression, or the threat of aggression, or in this case, actual aggression, and that's his mindset. And we used to think nuclear weapons were great deterrents. With this guy, I'm not so sure, particularly when it's a very different scenario.
It's a deterrent in a rational actor, but someone who has a failing economy, is looking at all the signals that things are only going to get worse, is himself towards the end of his life, maybe thinks he could go out with some bang, literally.
Yeah.
It's not a deterrent. My girlfriend's really really worried about it. Rightly so, but also it's crazy stuff.
Yeah, and he's probably fearful of Ukraine's a democracy. The people rose up and put in a charismatic young democratic leader. He's probably worried about what the Russian people might do if they follow the Ukraine's lead. So it's self-preservation as much as aggression towards Ukraine now. On that cheerful note.
Exactly. Yeah, just to end with something nice for people to carry on through their day.
Yeah.
But is there anything that you want to say specifically about sanctions, Russian economy, this moment that we didn't cover?
I think the important thing to remember in the in the integrated world, that there's a lot of alternatives to Russia, and Russia is not as dominant as it once was economically when it was the Soviet Union. So there are other sources of energy around the world. There are strong alliances around the world, and in some ways the power of the Ukraine people has sort of taught us all a lesson about having moral clarity, having a backbone, and having principles. And I think that's been the best gift so far of something where we've seen utter tragedy in terms of loss of life and damage and fear. The upside is that we have seen what Ukraine's been able to show the world.
Yeah, in such a globalized economy, you don't necessarily have to rely on just one strategic ally, which is great. And it looks like there are less and less really despotic leaders in charge of very powerful countries. I suppose just Russia and China's left. I mean, I don't know. Is that too simplistic of a take as well?
Well, a Jewish comedian can run the Ukraine and be a natural leader. They say that when they asked his mother, "You're very proud of your son for being so brave and courageous as president," she said, "My other son is a doctor."
What a legend.
Yes.
All right, Tim. Thanks very much, mate. And stay in touch.
My pleasure. Thanks, Ryan.
So you'll be able to find Tim on Twitter. I've linked what his Twitter is into the podcast description. There you will see everywhere that he's writing to, and you'll also have access to his books and his podcast through there as well. You will have noticed that I'm not making the typical appeal that I usually do in the more regular episodes on these specific ones about the Ukraine-Russian war. So instead, I would just ask that you share this with someone interested in the moment that's happening right now, because more episodes are going to be coming out in the following days and also following weeks who have a specific area of expertise relevant to this moment. Tomorrow, Gaida Hatu on how this affects the MENA region. I'm going to speak with a Ukrainian who's currently in the Ukraine. He's a developer, but now he's turned into a soldier, and so forth. So share it with someone who's interested in this moment. Keep it to yourself. Review it. All the rest. Follow Tim. Thank you very much.